Hey guys, tonight we begin with the grim, dank, and shadow-soaked world of medieval Europe. The lonely tragedy and quiet desperation of every hidden assassin's blade. The invisible role where a silent killer, a desperate farmer, and a betrayed nobleman could all share the same cold, dangerous night. It wasn't just a time of royalty, knights, and fair maidens. It was a world where disease, betrayal, blood-soaked streets, eerie superstitions, and strange midnight laughter all existed side by side under the flickering light of rusted lanterns. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine this. It's a cold, silent night. The kind where even the wind seems too scared to move. You're standing in a narrow, cobblestone alley, drenched in darkness, with nothing in your hand but a worn, rusted dagger. No one knows your name. No one's waiting for you at home. There's no backup, no witnesses, and no one coming to save you if things go wrong. All you can hear is the soft drip of rainwater from the rooftops and your own heartbeat pounding in your ears. The air smells of old stone, wet earth, and something metallic, blood, perhaps. Somewhere ahead, just around the next corner, death itself is waiting for you. Not a monster. Not a demon. A man, with a name, a story, a family, and tonight, you're the one meant to end it. What would you do? Turn back. Run. Or tighten your grip on that dagger and step into the shadows. Because in the world we're entering tonight, every decision carried blood on its hands, and most assassins never got a second chance. Now, let me ask you something. If you were an assassin in those days, lost in the shadows of crumbling castles and narrow alleyways, what would be your weapon of choice? Would you trust the cold, reliable steel of a dagger, slipping it between ribs in the dead of night? Or perhaps you'd go for poison, a silent killer hidden in a goblet of wine or baked into a loaf of bread, leaving no trace but a pale face and a lifeless body at dawn. Or maybe you'd get creative. Stage a fall from a crumbling tower, rig a carriage wheel to snap at just the right moment, or loosen a balcony rail so it gives way during a midnight meeting. A clever accident no one would suspect, except you. So tell me, which one would you choose? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what kind of assassin you'd be. Forget the Hollywood fantasies of the master assassin, the perfectly trained, impossibly skilled individual who dispatches targets with effortless precision and artistic flair. Those images, so pervasive in today's movies and video games, are a dazzling deception. The stark, often brutal truth of historical assassins paints a vastly different picture. Far from being expert killers, most medieval assassins weren't born into a shadowy guild or honed by years of specialized training. Instead, they were the broken, the desperate, and the overlooked. Most medieval assassins weren't expert killers. They were desperate farmers, failed soldiers, or betrayed lovers who turned to murder for a quick payday. Their grim profession was less a chosen path of cool competence and more a last, desperate resort, a chilling testament to the harsh exigencies of survival in a world that offered few other avenues for the downtrodden and the desperate. The pervasive image of the highly skilled, almost superhuman assassin is a modern invention, designed to entertain. In reality, the medieval world, particularly during periods of intense political upheaval or widespread poverty, produced killers of necessity, not of refined technique. Life for the common person was often a brutal, short existence, plagued by famine, disease, and the arbitrary whims of lords. For a desperate farmer, whose crops had failed due to the unpredictable shifts of the Little Ice Age or had been seized by rapacious feudal taxes, the choice between watching his family starve and committing a heinous act for coin became a terrifyingly real one. His skill wasn't in silent infiltration or complex combat maneuvers, but in the intimate knowledge of local terrain, the rhythms of village life, and the blunt force needed for a quick, brutal deed. He might know which path was least patrolled, where a target might linger alone, or how to strike with a farming implement adapted for lethal use. His hands, gnarled from working the earth, were capable of violence, born not of malice but of profound, agonizing desperation. His motivation was survival, pure and simple, and the fear of his family's suffering outweighed the terror of damnation or retribution. The pay for such a job, perhaps a few silver coins or a promise of grain, might be the only thing standing between his children and a slow, agonizing death from starvation. Then there were the failed soldiers, men who had perhaps seen the brutal realities of warfare but lacked the discipline, the strategic mind, or even the sheer luck to thrive within formal military structures. They might have deserted, been discharged for insubordination, or simply found themselves unemployed after a conflict ended, their only marketable skill being violence. These were not the chivalrous knights of legend, but rough, often traumatized individuals, adrift in a society that had little use for them once the fighting ceased. Their expertise lay in direct confrontation, in the ability to wield a blade or a club, but often lacked the finesse or stealth of their fictional counterparts. They were blunt instruments, more prone to brawls than clandestine operations. Their desperation for a quick payday was palpable. Without a lord to serve or a battle to fight, their existence was one of begging, petty crime, or slow destitution. The prospect of an assassination, however morally repugnant, offered a familiar means to an end, a way to put their brutal experience to immediate, profitable use. Their pasts had already hardened them to violence, making the leap to murder a less daunting, though still terrible, step. They often operated with a brutal directness, relying on surprise and overwhelming force rather than subtle trickery. And perhaps most tragically, there were the betrayed lovers. These were individuals consumed not by greed or poverty, but by raw, searing emotion, vengeance. A spouse who had discovered adultery, a partner abandoned for another, a lover whose trust had been shattered by deceit. In a world where justice for personal wrongs was often elusive, and where honor was paramount, a quick payday might not be monetary but emotional. The payment was retribution, the satisfaction of exacting a bitter revenge against those who had wronged them, or against rivals who had stolen their happiness. Their skill was fueled by an intense, personal fury, capable of lending them a terrifying focus and a chilling disregard for consequences. They might not be physically imposing or tactically brilliant, but their intimate knowledge of the victim's routines, vulnerabilities, and personal connections could make them exceptionally dangerous. Their motives were primal, deeply human, and often far more terrifying in their personal intensity than any professional contract. The act of murder, for them, was not a job but a catharsis, a desperate attempt to reclaim a semblance of control over a life that felt utterly ruined. The payday was the fleeting satisfaction of seeing their betrayer suffer, a grim recompense for their shattered heart. These historical assassins stood in stark contrast to the sophisticated, often technologically advanced, figures of modern fiction. Forget the silent poisons slipped into drinks in grand ballrooms. Often, it was a brutal, up-close confrontation with a crudely sharpened tool. There was no clean escape into the night for most. As we discussed, most assassins would flee their homeland after a kill because they'd rarely survive the aftermath. The entire machinery of the state, guards, spies, vengeful families, would be unleashed, turning the hunter into the hunted. Their employers, if they had any, were rarely loyal, often choosing to eliminate the assassin to tie up loose ends, transforming their instrument into a liability. The very longevity and success of a career in assassination were incredibly rare. Beyond the immediate danger of retribution, their lives were a constant, grueling battle against disease. They faced the chilling risk of dying from disease before even carrying out a job. A sudden fever, a debilitating stomach ailment, a festering wound from a mundane accident. Any of these could render them useless, or worse, lead to their silent demise in some forgotten corner, their contract unfulfilled. This terrifying vulnerability to illness underscored the profound fragility of their existence, a stark reminder that the smallest microbe could derail the most meticulously planned act of violence. And above all, they were condemned to living in constant anxiety, waiting for death to find them. Every shadow held a potential threat, every strange face a possible hunter, every meal a potential poison. Their sleep, if they found any, was fitful, haunted by nightmares of past deeds and future retribution. Their lives were a slow, agonizing wait for the moment their luck ran out, a morbid countdown to their cold, brutal, and often solitary end. This was the true nature of their profession, a life consumed by paranoia, isolated by the very acts they committed, and perpetually haunted by the specter of their own brutal mortality. In conclusion, the glamorous image of the assassin is a captivating, yet ultimately misleading, fantasy. The grim truth of medieval assassins reveals individuals who were not expert killers by design, but desperate souls driven to extreme violence by dire circumstances. They were desperate farmers, failed soldiers, or betrayed lovers who turned to murder for a quick payday, their methods often crude, their lives perpetually at risk from disease and betrayal, and their ultimate fate almost invariably cold, lonely, and brutal. Their story is a powerful, sobering reminder that the most dangerous violence often arises not from sophisticated skill, but from the raw, agonizing depths of human desperation. It is a world away from the cool, stylized figures of our screens, revealing instead the grim, unvarnished reality of survival in an unforgiving age. The romanticized image of an assassin, so prevalent in modern entertainment, is a carefully constructed illusion. We're fed tales of highly skilled, enigmatic figures who operate with ruthless efficiency, their services handsomely rewarded. But the brutal, unvarnished truth of historical assassins paints a vastly different picture. Their lives were not glamorous. They were a relentless, grinding struggle against forces far more pervasive than their human targets. This grim reality is perhaps nowhere more evident than in the chilling betrayal that often awaited them. Many assassins were double-crossed. After a kill, they were often poisoned or reported to authorities to avoid paying them. This wasn't merely a risk, it was an almost inherent component of their terrifying profession, a testament to the ultimate expendability of a human life once its violent purpose had been served. The very nature of an assassin's work demanded absolute secrecy and discretion, qualities that, ironically, made them incredibly vulnerable. Their clients, often powerful figures, ambitious nobles, vengeful rivals, or desperate rulers, sought to eliminate enemies without leaving a traceable link back to themselves. The assassin was a necessary evil, a tool to be used and then, crucially, discarded. Once the kill was complete, the assassin transformed from a valuable asset into a dangerous liability. They possessed intimate knowledge of their employer's dark dealings, their motives, and their methods. They were a loose end, a potential weak point that could be exploited by enemies, or worse, turn informant under duress, unraveling a carefully woven web of conspiracy. Thus, eliminating the assassin became a cold, calculated, and often logical next step in ensuring absolute secrecy and minimizing future risk. The payment, if it came at all, might arrive accompanied by a hidden blade, a poisoned drink, or a sudden ambush orchestrated by those they had just served. They were often poisoned, a silent, insidious method that left little trace and allowed the employer to claim innocence or even mourn the assassin's sudden demise. A meal, a celebratory drink, a seemingly innocent gesture of thanks, any could be the vehicle for their demise. The effects of the poison would often be agonizing, leading to a slow, painful death that was far from the quick, cinematic end we're accustomed to. This betrayal deepens their profound isolation, as genuine camaraderie or lasting alliances were almost impossible, knowing that their very success could become the catalyst for their own agonizing demise. Alternatively, or in conjunction with poisoning, assassins were frequently reported to authorities to avoid paying them. This was a particularly cynical form of double-cross. The employer could alert the local watch or feudal lord to the presence of a dangerous murderer in their midst, providing just enough information to ensure capture without implicating themselves. The assassin, now hunted by the very authorities they had sought to evade, would face certain capture, torture, and a brutal public execution. The reward for their service became a death sentence, while their employer saved their precious coin and simultaneously removed a dangerous witness. This cynical maneuver highlights the brutal pragmatism of power in the medieval world. Human lives, especially those of the desperate and the disposable, were cheap commodities, valued only for their immediate utility. The world they inhabited was one of shifting loyalties and ruthless self-interest. Sentiments like gratitude or fair compensation were luxuries rarely afforded to those who dealt in death. This pervasive betrayal deeply shaped the assassin's day-to-day existence. They lived in a constant state of profound psychological torment, perpetually waiting for death to find them. Every shadow held a potential threat, every strange face a possible hunter, every seemingly innocuous interaction a potential trap. Their sleep, if they found any, was fitful, haunted by nightmares of past deeds and future retribution. Their days were spent in a state of hypervigilance, constantly observing, calculating, predicting, unable to truly relax or find peace. This relentless anxiety gnawed at their souls, eroding any semblance of mental well-being. They understood, perhaps more acutely than anyone, the profound fragility of life and the stark inevitability of their own violent demise. This environment of pervasive distrust meant that the assassin was condemned to a life of profound loneliness. They could trust no one, for every relationship carried the risk of betrayal, every friend a potential informant. Love, family, genuine companionship, these were luxuries they could rarely afford, burdens that would expose them, weaknesses that could be exploited. Even within their own secretive organizations, if they belonged to one, trust was a rare commodity. They lived in a perpetual state of paranoia, their minds constantly replaying scenarios of capture, interrogation, and agonizing death. The weight of their deeds, the lives they had taken, the constant fear of being hunted, these were burdens they carried alone, unable to confide in anyone, trapped within the confines of their own tormented minds. The silence that surrounded them was not peaceful. It was the chilling void of human connection, a profound echo of their solitary, hunted existence. Furthermore, their bodies were as vulnerable as their minds. They faced the chilling risk of dying from disease before even carrying out a job. In an age without modern medicine, a simple cough could escalate into fatal pneumonia. A festering wound from a minor mishap could lead to agonizing sepsis. Their rigorous training, if it existed beyond desperate necessity, certainly didn't include immunology. Their bodies, often malnourished from irregular meals and constantly strained by exertion and lack of rest, were vulnerable vessels. Imagine the grim irony: a meticulously planned assassination, a complex web of espionage and strategy, brought to an abrupt and ignoble end not by a watchful guard or a vengeful lord, but by a fever, a gut-wrenching ailment, or a debilitating chill caught while lurking in a damp alley. This constant, silent threat was a pervasive reality, a grim reaper that walked alongside them long before they ever reached their intended victim, underscoring the profound fragility of their lives and the utter lack of control they had over their own destinies. In conclusion, the glamorous image of the assassin is a dangerous fantasy. It strips away the true horror, the profound isolation, and the agonizing fate that defined the lives of their historical counterparts. There was no cool in hiding in squalid conditions disguised as a beggar, in the terrifying act of a messy kill, in the constant gnawing paranoia of pursuit, or in the agonizing death that awaited most. The reality of the historical assassin's life was cold, lonely, and brutal. It was a testament to desperation, fanaticism, and the grim, unvarnished truth of violence, a far cry from the seductive whispers of legend. They lived a life where even the promised reward for their deadliest acts was a betrayal, a final, cynical act of their employers to erase them completely. To truly understand them is to confront the stark, uncomfortable truth that their deadliest skill was not combat, but concealment, and their only escape was often flight into a permanent, terrified exile, or, more likely, a swift, brutal end at the hands of those they had served. The allure of the assassin in popular culture is often tied to their fantastical weaponry. The retractable wrist blades, the silent crossbows, the elaborate poisons delivered with surgical precision. Movies and games paint a picture of highly specialized, almost futuristic tools wielded by equally specialized killers. But this shiny veneer shatters when we confront the grim reality of history. Forget slick hidden blades. Medieval assassins used kitchen knives, ropes, blunt rocks, and sometimes their bare hands. Their arsenal wasn't about sophistication. It was about brutal efficacy born of desperation, making their methods terrifyingly crude and their kills shockingly visceral. First, let's cast aside the myth of the custom-made, silent weapon. Most medieval assassins weren't operating with state-of-the-art instruments forged by master craftsmen for their dark purpose. Instead, they relied on what was readily available, inconspicuous, and effective in a desperate moment. The humble kitchen knife was a ubiquitous and deadly choice. Every household had one, making it easy to acquire and difficult to trace. It was sharp enough to inflict fatal wounds, yet mundane enough not to draw undue suspicion if carried by a seemingly ordinary peasant or traveler. Imagine the close-quarters terror of a life ending with a common kitchen implement, a stark contrast to the distant, impersonal kill of fiction. This wasn't about stealth. It was often about seizing an opportune moment, a sudden lunge in a dark alley or a crowded street, relying on surprise and the victim's immediate incapacitation. The blade might be dull, requiring multiple, agonizing blows, making the act even more brutal and messy. Then there was the chilling simplicity of ropes. Not just for binding, but for silent strangulation. A rope could be concealed easily, deployed swiftly, and left little obvious external wound beyond ligature marks around the neck, often mistaken for a fall or other accident if the body was found hours later. The act of strangulation is profoundly personal, requiring immense physical strength and a chilling proximity to the victim. It speaks to a killer driven by absolute necessity, willing to engage in a terrifyingly intimate struggle for a grim purpose. It also points to the sheer desperation for a method that ensured silence, preventing screams from alerting others. This was the assassin as brute force, as an instrument of suffocation, their hands often the most direct tools of death. Perhaps even more primitive, yet horrifyingly effective, were blunt rocks or other improvised blunt objects. A heavy stone, a piece of broken timber, a crude club. These were the weapons of the truly desperate, the tools of last resort. Such implements left no clean wounds, only devastating, crushing trauma. A blow to the head with a rock in a darkened street or a secluded path was a quick, brutal way to silence a target, relying on overwhelming force rather than skill. This method highlighted the assassin's lack of formal training and reliance on pure, visceral violence. It also meant that their kills were inherently messy, leaving behind undeniable evidence of savage intent and a scene of horrifying, primal brutality. There was no art, no finesse, only the raw application of force. And sometimes, in the most terrifying of close encounters, medieval assassins used their bare hands. Suffocation, snapped necks, dislocated joints leading to death. These were the methods of last resort, or perhaps of killers driven by an intensely personal hatred or a desire for absolute control over their victims' last moments. To take a life with one's bare hands required a chilling proximity, a willingness to engage in the most intimate form of violence, feeling the last struggles of the target. This stripped away any pretense of professionalism, revealing the raw, unfiltered violence at the core of their grim task. It was the most visceral form of murder, leaving the assassin utterly drenched not just in blood, but in the terrifying reality of their act. These primitive tools reflect the reality that most medieval assassins weren't expert killers trained in specialized combat. They were often desperate farmers, driven to murder for survival, using the tools of their trade in a horrifying new context. They were failed soldiers, perhaps skilled in a brawl but lacking the finesse for covert operations, relying on their brutal strength. Or they were betrayed lovers, fueled by vengeance, using whatever blunt instrument of fury they could find. Their skill wasn't in their weaponry, but in their cunning, their ruthlessness, and their willingness to embrace a brutality that transcended any notion of martial artistry. Their lives were perpetually at risk. They faced the chilling risk of dying from disease before even carrying out a job, their bodies vulnerable to the common ailments of the age. And perhaps the most cynical truth was that they were often killed by their own employers after completing a task, poisoned or reported to authorities to avoid payment and eliminate a dangerous loose end. This meant they lived in a state of constant anxiety, waiting for death to find them, whether by disease, betrayal, or the sharp end of a guard spear. Their tools were primitive, their lives expendable, and their fate almost invariably cold, lonely, and brutal. The images we consume today are thrilling fictions. The historical truth is a sobering reminder that the tools of death in a desperate age were as raw and unforgiving as the lives they extinguished. The romanticized image of the assassin, so pervasive in modern entertainment, depicts a figure of sleek mystery, moving through shadows with an almost supernatural grace, their identity often concealed by a stylish hood or an enigmatic mask. But this thrilling illusion shatters when confronted with the grim reality of history. Forget the bespoke uniforms and the aristocratic swagger. For most historical assassins, the very essence of their survival lay in their absolute anonymity, in their ability to become utterly invisible within the chaotic fabric of medieval society. To achieve this, they shed any semblance of their true selves, embracing the lowest, most overlooked strata of humanity. Thus, to stay hidden, assassins strategically disguised themselves as beggars, sick travelers, or street performers, adopting lives of squalor, vulnerability, or fleeting entertainment, precisely because these roles allowed them to observe, approach, and vanish without suspicion, becoming ghosts in plain sight. The disguise of a beggar was perhaps the most effective and widely adopted. In any medieval city, beggars were a ubiquitous sight, an unfortunate but commonplace element of the urban landscape. They huddled in doorways, shuffled through crowded marketplaces, and extended their hands for alms, their presence so unremarkable as to be almost invisible. For an assassin, this was the perfect cover. A beggar could linger for hours in a fixed location, observing the comings and goings of a target's household, memorizing routines, noting guard changes, and listening to casual conversations, all without drawing undue attention. Who would suspect a shivering wretch, covered in rags and grime, of possessing deadly intent? Their physical appearance, often emaciated from self-imposed or real hunger, their clothes worn and patched, their hair matted, perfectly conveyed destitution, deterring close inspection. They were dismissed as unfortunate, pitiable, or simply beneath notice. This allowed them unparalleled access to areas that would be off-limits to anyone of higher status. They could blend into the background of a bustling square near a noble's residence, or inconspicuously follow a target through narrow alleyways, their movements unquestioned, their presence entirely normalized by their apparent misery. The very act of begging provided a legitimate reason for their lingering presence, diverting suspicion and allowing them to gather crucial intelligence, their true purpose hidden beneath layers of simulated suffering. Equally potent was the disguise of a sick traveler. Medieval roads were filled with a constant stream of pilgrims, merchants, and vagrants. A sick traveler, particularly one suffering from a non-contagious but debilitating ailment or feigning one, would evoke pity, or at least a wide berth, from others. They might stumble into a village, seeking temporary shelter or a cup of water, their exhaustion and visible distress explaining their presence. This disguise offered unique advantages. It allowed the assassin to move through different territories without strong ties, their transient nature raising fewer questions. A sick traveler might be overlooked by patrols, their movements excused by their apparent infirmity. They could pause to rest near a target's route, their presence appearing incidental. The very pity they evoked could grant them access to places they might otherwise be denied, as compassionate souls might offer them food or a brief respite, inadvertently bringing the wolf into the fold. This disguise also allowed them to explain away any unusual behavior, a sudden weakness, a need to hide from the sun or wind, as symptoms of their illness, diverting suspicion from their true, deadly mission. The physical discomfort was real, the constant vulnerability acute, but the anonymity it provided was invaluable. But perhaps no omen was as instantly chilling, as universally understood, and as profoundly debilitating as a black cat crossing their path before a job, considered a death sentence. The black cat, with its stealthy movements and nocturnal habits, was often associated with witchcraft, darkness, and the devil himself. To have one cross your path, especially when embarking on a dangerous endeavor like an assassination, was interpreted as a definitive sign of impending doom, an unchangeable pronouncement by fate that the mission was cursed and would end in failure, capture, or death. This wasn't a minor setback, it was a psychological paralysis. For an assassin, whose success relied on unwavering resolve and absolute focus, such an omen could shatter their nerve, filling them with a paralyzing dread. They might abandon the mission entirely, or proceed with such crippling anxiety that their judgment was impaired, making them more prone to error and, indeed, more likely to face the very fate the omen predicted. The sheer power of collective belief meant that even if an assassin consciously tried to dismiss it, the ingrained fear would likely permeate their subconscious, affecting their confidence and decision-making in a high-stakes, life-or-death situation. These pervasive superstitions compounded the already monumental day-to-day struggles of a historical assassin. They were not expert killers, but desperate farmers, failed soldiers, or betrayed lovers driven by circumstance. Their tools were primitive: kitchen knives, ropes, blunt rocks, bare hands, requiring brutal proximity to their victim. To avoid detection, they lived as beggars, sick travelers, or street performers, embracing anonymity in squalor. Their jobs were grueling, taking weeks to track a target through medieval cities that had no maps, no phones, just rumors and dangerous alleys. They faced the constant risk of dying from disease before even carrying out a job, their bodies vulnerable to common ailments. And the ultimate betrayal awaited them, as they were often killed by their own employers after completing a task to avoid payment and eliminate a dangerous witness. Thus, they lived in constant anxiety, waiting for death to find them, whether by illness, betrayal, capture, or the chilling pronouncement of a black cat, knowing that getting caught was a fate worse than death, leading to public torture, maiming, or dismemberment. In conclusion, the glamorous assassin of fiction is a dangerous fantasy. The grim reality of historical assassins reveals individuals who operated not with cold, rational detachment, but within a world profoundly shaped by unseen forces. Superstitions made their work harder, turning every shadow into a potential threat, every animal into a potential omen. The deep-seated belief in curses, witches, and omens, particularly the terrifying notion that a black cat crossing their path before a job was considered a death sentence, instilled a debilitating fear that undermined their resolve and made their already perilous lives even more agonizing. Their story is a powerful, sobering reminder that the most dangerous battles they faced were often not against their human targets, but against the crushing weight of their own minds, haunted by the pervasive fears and dark beliefs of their age. The romanticized image of the assassin in popular culture often features a figure beholden to a code, perhaps a shadowy guild, or at least operating within a clear, if illicit, contractual agreement with their patrons. They complete their deadly task, collect their handsome reward, and vanish, perhaps to be called upon again. But this thrilling illusion of a reliable, albeit dark, business transaction shatters against the grim reality of history. For the real historical assassin, operating in a brutal world defined by ruthless power plays and expedient betrayals, Their greatest peril often came not from their target's guards, but from the very hand that fed them. The chilling truth was that their employers were untrustworthy. Nobles and kings would hire assassins, then almost immediately order them killed to cover their tracks, transforming a valuable asset into a dangerous liability the moment the blood dried, and ensuring that the assassin's ultimate fate was almost invariably cold, lonely, and brutal. The very nature of an assassination, particularly one targeting a powerful political or social figure, demanded absolute secrecy and deniability. Nobles, kings, ambitious churchmen, or powerful merchants, driven by greed, vengeance, or a thirst for power, would commission these grim deeds to eliminate rivals, silence inconvenient witnesses, or clear a path to influence. Their primary goal was to achieve the desired outcome, the death of their enemy, without leaving any traceable link back to themselves. The assassin, a necessary instrument of this dark will, was simultaneously an undeniable threat. They possessed intimate, damning knowledge of their employer's darkest secrets, their motives, their methods, and the very machinations of their power. This knowledge made the assassin a perpetually ticking time bomb, a loose end that could be exploited by enemies, or worse, turn informant under duress, unraveling a carefully woven web of conspiracy and exposing the patron to ruin, public disgrace, or even execution. Thus, the moment the blood of the target was spilled, the assassin's utility swiftly inverted. They transformed from a valuable asset into an immediate and profound liability. Eliminating the assassin became not merely an option, but a cold, calculated, and often logical next step in ensuring absolute secrecy and minimizing all future risk. The payment, if it came at all, might arrive accompanied by a hidden blade, a poisoned drink, or a sudden ambush orchestrated by agents of the very patron who had commissioned the kill. Assassins were often poisoned, a particularly insidious and favored method due to its relative discretion. A meal, a celebratory drink, a seemingly innocent gesture of thanks, or even a simple flask of water offered after a grueling journey, any could be the vehicle for their agonizing demise. The effects of the poison would frequently be agonizing, leading to a slow, painful, and often undiagnosable death that allowed the employer to feign innocence, express false regret, or even mourn the assassin's sudden demise, further diverting suspicion. This profound betrayal, delivered by the hand that had just offered coin, deepened the assassin's already pervasive sense of isolation, making genuine camaraderie or lasting alliances almost impossible. They existed in a terrifying vacuum of trust, knowing that their very success, the ultimate proof of their dangerous competence, could become the direct catalyst for their own agonizing end. The primary tools for gathering intelligence were rumors and dangerous allies. Rumors, the lifeblood of medieval social networks, were invaluable but notoriously unreliable. An assassin would spend days, perhaps weeks, haunting taverns, market squares, and public gathering places, listening to snippets of conversation, piecing together fragments of gossip about the target's routines, habits, associates, and vulnerabilities. Was the target a frequent visitor to a particular church? Did they attend specific court functions? Did they have a preferred mistress or a secret gambling den? Each piece of information was a puzzle piece, often distorted by exaggeration, misunderstanding, or malicious intent. Verifying these rumors required tedious, painstaking observation, often involving days of discreet tailing, lurking in shadows, and adopting various disguises. This deep dive into the city's underbelly exposed the assassin to constant peril, for the very alleys they navigated were teeming with their own dangers: petty criminals, rival gangs, suspicious watchmen, and desperate vagrants. Every shadowy corner could conceal a threat. Every casual encounter could lead to capture or betrayal. These were not the sanitized, stylized alleys of fiction, but foul-smelling, disease-ridden labyrinths where life was cheap and justice rare. Beyond the physical challenges, the sheer amount of time involved created immense psychological pressure. An assassin was living in a perpetual state of heightened anxiety, often for weeks on end, always on guard, always observing, always planning. The boredom of waiting, the frustration of dead ends, and the constant fear of discovery gnawed at their minds, eroding their resolve and sharpening their paranoia. This prolonged period of intense stress was a silent torment, often more draining than the act of violence itself. They might have to observe a target for days, learning their preferred routes, the number of guards, the exact timing of their movements, all while remaining utterly invisible. This detailed reconnaissance was crucial but excruciatingly slow. Moreover, the nature of medieval life itself contributed to the extended timeline. Targets, particularly high-status individuals, lived heavily guarded lives, surrounded by retinues, constantly moving within secured spaces. Breaking through these layers of security, or finding a moment of vulnerability, required meticulous planning and often immense patience. Unlike modern societies where a person might live alone, medieval nobles were rarely solitary. Their households were vast, filled with servants, guards, and family, making discreet access incredibly difficult. The assassin might have to wait for a specific event, a public procession, a feast, a pilgrimage, to find a window of opportunity, events that were often weeks or months apart. In conclusion, the glamorous image of the swift, precise assassin is a modern fantasy. The grim reality for medieval assassins was a brutal, drawn-out process. Assassination jobs took weeks, not hours. Tracking a target through medieval cities took forever, a testament to the lack of maps and phones, forcing them to rely on unreliable rumors and navigate truly dangerous alleys. Their lives were a grinding cycle of desperate disguise, painstaking observation, and relentless paranoia, punctuated by moments of extreme violence. This constant, pervasive anxiety, coupled with the ever-present threat of disease and the almost inevitable betrayal by their own employers, meant that their lives were anything but cool or glamorous. They were a testament to extreme human endurance, performing their grim tasks in a world that offered them no quarter and ultimately, no escape from a cold, lonely, and brutal fate. The romanticized image of the assassin in modern entertainment often culminates in a swift, climactic showdown where, if caught, they face a quick, clean end, perhaps even a heroic last stand or a noble sacrifice. But this thrilling fiction utterly betrays the chilling, visceral truth of history. For the real historical assassin, operating in a brutal world defined by swift and often disproportionate justice, getting caught was a fate worse than death. It was not merely about the termination of life. It was about the systematic, agonizing destruction of the body and spirit, a public spectacle designed to instill profound terror and serve as a horrifying, unforgettable example. They weren't simply executed. They were subjected to a litany of unspeakable horrors, publicly tortured, maimed, or dismembered, their bodies transformed into grim warnings etched into the collective memory of the populace. The moment of capture for an assassin was the absolute worst-case scenario, the abrupt end of their precarious existence in the shadows. There were no comfortable prisons, no legal rights, no due process as we understand it today. Once apprehended, the individual was immediately deemed guilty by association with their heinous act. The first phase of their torment was almost invariably torture. This wasn't about quick information extraction, though that was a secondary goal. It was primarily about inflicting maximal pain, breaking the spirit, and forcing public confessions, often regardless of truth. The methods were varied and terrifyingly creative. The rack, stretching limbs to the point of dislocation; the strappado, hoisting victims high by their bound wrists, dislocating shoulders; thumb screws crushing digits; pincers tearing flesh; hot irons searing skin. Every muscle, every nerve, every bone was an instrument of agony. This wasn't done in secret. It was often conducted in dark, damp dungeons where screams could echo, or in more public settings, near courthouses or town squares, so that the sounds of suffering could permeate the consciousness of the populace, a chilling prelude to their eventual fate. The purpose was to utterly dehumanize, to strip away dignity, and to demonstrate the absolute, terrifying power of the state or the vengeful lord. Following, or often as part of, the torture, the assassin would be publicly maimed. This form of punishment, often seen as a step short of death but in many ways more cruel, was designed to create a lasting, living testament to their crime. Hands, the instruments of their deadly trade, might be chopped off. Tongues, which might whisper secrets or defiance, could be ripped out. Eyes, which had spied on targets, could be gouged. Ears, which had listened for rumors, might be severed. These were not quick acts. They were often performed slowly, deliberately, with crude tools, in front of horrified crowds. The intention was twofold: to permanently disfigure the condemned, marking them as a perpetual outcast and criminal, and to provide a terrifying visual deterrent to anyone else who might contemplate similar acts. A maimed assassin, left to beg in the streets, unable to perform any labor, utterly reliant on charity, was a living embodiment of the consequences of challenging authority. Their disfigured body was a permanent monument to the state's unwavering justice, a gruesome reminder of the pain that awaited those who dared to step outside the bounds. Even more horrifying, and reserved for the most heinous of crimes, was dismemberment. This wasn't merely execution. It was the systematic carving up of the body, often while the victim was still alive or only recently deceased. Drawing and quartering, where the victim was dragged by horses until their limbs were torn from their body, was a particularly gruesome method. Decapitation, while often a swift end, was sometimes followed by the public display of the head on a pike. Bodies might be hung in chains until they rotted, or their parts distributed to different corners of a city or region, sending a chilling message across vast distances. This level of brutality was designed to desecrate the body, denying it a proper burial and therefore, in the eyes of many, condemning the soul to an eternity of torment. It was the ultimate act of state power, a complete annihilation of the individual, transforming them into a fragmented object of terror. The purpose was clear: to set an example so brutal, so utterly horrifying, that it would deter anyone, no matter how desperate or ambitious, from even contemplating the crime of assassination or any challenge to established authority. The public nature of these punishments was key. They were meticulously orchestrated spectacles, attended by vast crowds, men, women, and children, who were forced, or drawn by morbid curiosity, to witness the agonizing fate of the condemned. The screams of the tortured, the sight of blood and torn flesh, the raw, visceral display of pain, these were not merely unfortunate byproducts. They were central to the state's message. The assassin, stripped of dignity and humanity, became a cautionary tale, a living, breathing symbol of the terrible price of defiance. This public spectacle served as a powerful tool of social control, reinforcing obedience to power and terrifying descent into silence. This grim reality stands in stark contrast to the fictional assassin's life. They were never sleek, sophisticated professionals. Most medieval assassins weren't expert killers. They were desperate farmers, failed soldiers, or betrayed lovers driven by circumstance or vengeance, using kitchen knives, ropes, blunt rocks, and sometimes their bare hands. Their anonymity was their only shield, prompting them to disguise themselves as beggars, sick travelers, or street performers to stay hidden. Their jobs were grueling, often taking weeks of painstaking reconnaissance, relying solely on rumors and dangerous alleys with no maps or phones. They faced the chilling risk of dying from disease before even carrying out a job, and often the ultimate betrayal of being killed by their own employers after completing a task. They lived in constant anxiety, waiting for death to find them. But the chilling truth was that if death came by capture, it was prolonged, agonizing, and often public. In conclusion, the glamorous assassin of fiction is a dangerous fantasy that sanitizes a brutal historical reality. For the real historical assassin, getting caught was a fate worse than death. They were not merely executed. They were publicly tortured, maimed, or dismembered to set an example, their bodies becoming gruesome, unforgettable lessons in the terrifying consequences of challenging power. Their lives were a relentless cycle of desperation, paranoia, and violence, leading almost inevitably to a public, agonizing end that served as a stark, chilling reminder that in the cold, brutal world of medieval power, human life was cheap, and justice, when it came, was a spectacle of terror. The romanticized image of the assassin in modern entertainment often features a figure of cold, rational precision, unburdened by irrational fears, calculating every move with scientific detachment. Yet, the grim truth of historical assassins reveals a vastly different reality. Their lives, already fraught with immense physical danger and psychological torment, were further complicated, often profoundly hindered, by the pervasive, inescapable grip of superstitions that made their work harder. In a world where the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural were thin and permeable, people believed deeply in curses, witches, and omens. This meant that an assassin's meticulous plans, their courage, and their very resolve could be shattered by something as seemingly innocuous as a black cat crossing their path before a job, which was considered a death sentence, a chilling pronouncement of inevitable failure and a brutal end. The medieval mind, lacking modern scientific understanding, often attributed inexplicable events, from sudden illness to crop failure to unexpected death, to supernatural causes. This fertile ground of fear and uncertainty bred a multitude of superstitions, turning everyday occurrences into signs, warnings, or pronouncements of fate. For an assassin, whose life hung by a thread, every unusual event, every unexpected encounter, could be interpreted through this deeply ingrained lens of omens and portents. The sight of a raven on a rooftop, the hoot of an owl at dusk, the spilling of salt, the breaking of a mirror, each carried a specific, often negative, connotation that could induce paralyzing fear or alter their entire approach to a task. This wasn't mere quaint folklore. It was a deeply held conviction that the universe was constantly communicating, sending signals of fortune or doom, and to ignore them was to invite disaster. The belief in curses was particularly potent and terrifying. An assassin might worry about being cursed by a victim's family, by a powerful witch, or simply by the sheer evil of their own deeds. A curse could manifest as ill luck, crippling disease, sudden accidents, or even a slow, agonizing death. The psychological impact of believing oneself cursed could be devastating, eroding confidence and instilling a fatalistic dread that would hinder their ability to act decisively. Every setback, every near miss, every failed attempt at their grim task would be interpreted not as mere bad luck or poor planning, but as the insidious work of a malevolent enchantment, making their work even more psychologically taxing. This belief often led them to seek out countercharms, amulets, or the blessings of a priest, adding layers of ritual and complexity to their already dangerous profession, acknowledging a power beyond their blade. Then there was the terrifying reality of witches. Medieval society was gripped by a pervasive fear of witchcraft, believing that individuals could harness dark powers to inflict harm, cast spells, and even control the weather or cause illness. An assassin, constantly operating in secrecy and fear, might dread encountering a witch, or worse, becoming the target of a witch's wrath. They might worry that their target was protected by dark magic, rendering their efforts futile. The very act of taking a life, seen as a transgression against divine law, might also make them vulnerable to demonic influence or the vengeance of vengeful spirits, increasing their reliance on charms, prayers, or counter-rituals that added friction to their plans. This fear could lead them to avoid certain paths, certain villages, or even specific times of day, if they were associated with rumored witchcraft or malevolent presences, further complicating their already difficult task of tracking a target. But perhaps no omen was as instantly chilling, as universally understood, and as profoundly debilitating as a black cat crossing their path before a job, considered a death sentence. The black cat, with its stealthy movements and nocturnal habits, was often associated with witchcraft, darkness, and the devil himself. To have one cross your path, especially when embarking on a dangerous endeavor like an assassination, was interpreted as a definitive sign of impending doom, an unchangeable pronouncement by fate that the mission was cursed and would end in failure, capture, or death. This wasn't a minor setback, it was a psychological paralysis. For an assassin, whose success relied on unwavering resolve and absolute focus, such an omen could shatter their nerve, filling them with a paralyzing dread. They might abandon the mission entirely, or proceed with such crippling anxiety that their judgment was impaired, making them more prone to error and, indeed, more likely to face the very fate the omen predicted. The sheer power of collective belief meant that even if an assassin consciously tried to dismiss it, the ingrained fear would likely permeate their subconscious, affecting their confidence and decision-making in a high-stakes, life-or-death situation. These pervasive superstitions compounded the already monumental day-to-day struggles of a historical assassin. They were not expert killers, but desperate farmers, failed soldiers, or betrayed lovers driven by circumstance. Their tools were primitive: kitchen knives, ropes, blunt rocks, bare hands, requiring brutal proximity to their victim. To avoid detection, they lived as beggars, sick travelers, or street performers, embracing anonymity in squalor. Their jobs were grueling, taking weeks to track a target through medieval cities that had no maps, no phones, just rumors and dangerous alleys. They faced the constant risk of dying from disease before even carrying out a job, their bodies vulnerable to common ailments. And the ultimate betrayal awaited them, as they were often killed by their own employers after completing a task to avoid payment and eliminate a dangerous witness. Thus, they lived in constant anxiety, waiting for death to find them, whether by illness, betrayal, capture, or the chilling pronouncement of a black cat, knowing that getting caught was a fate worse than death, leading to public torture, maiming, or dismemberment. In conclusion, the glamorous assassin of fiction is a dangerous fantasy. The grim reality of historical assassins reveals individuals who operated not with cold, rational detachment, but within a world profoundly shaped by unseen forces. Superstitions made their work harder, turning every shadow into a potential threat, every animal into a potential omen. The deep-seated belief in curses, witches, and omens, particularly the terrifying notion that a black cat crossing their path before a job was considered a death sentence, instilled a debilitating fear that undermined their resolve and made their already perilous lives even more agonizing. Their story is a powerful, sobering reminder that the most dangerous battles they faced were often not against their human targets, but against the crushing weight of their own minds, haunted by the pervasive fears and dark beliefs of their age. The romanticized image of the assassin in popular culture often features a figure beholden to a code, perhaps a shadowy guild, or at least operating within a clear, if illicit, contractual agreement with their patrons. They complete their deadly task, collect their handsome reward, and vanish, perhaps to be called upon again. But this thrilling illusion of a reliable, albeit dark, business transaction shatters against the grim reality of history. For the real historical assassin, operating in a brutal world defined by ruthless power plays and expedient betrayals, their greatest peril often came not from their target's guards, but from the very hand that fed them. The chilling truth was that their employers were untrustworthy. Nobles and kings would hire assassins, then almost immediately order them killed to cover their tracks, transforming a valuable asset into a dangerous liability the moment the blood dried, and ensuring that the assassin's ultimate fate was almost invariably cold, lonely, and brutal. The very nature of an assassination, particularly one targeting a powerful political or social figure, demanded absolute secrecy and deniability. Nobles, kings, ambitious churchmen, or powerful merchants, driven by greed, vengeance, or a thirst for power, would commission these grim deeds to eliminate rivals, silence inconvenient witnesses, or clear a path to influence. Their primary goal was to achieve the desired outcome, the death of their enemy, without leaving any traceable link back to themselves. The assassin, a necessary instrument of this dark will, was simultaneously an undeniable threat. They possessed intimate, damning knowledge of their employer's darkest secrets, their motives, their methods, and the very machinations of their power. This knowledge made the assassin a perpetually ticking time bomb, a loose end that could be exploited by enemies, or worse, turn informant under duress, unraveling a carefully woven web of conspiracy and exposing the patron to ruin, public disgrace, or even execution. Thus, the moment the blood of the target was spilled, the assassin's utility swiftly inverted. They transformed from a valuable asset into an immediate and profound liability. Eliminating the assassin became not merely an option, but a cold, calculated, and often logical next step in ensuring absolute secrecy and minimizing all future risk. The payment, if it came at all, might arrive accompanied by a hidden blade, a poisoned drink, or a sudden ambush orchestrated by agents of the very patron who had commissioned the kill. Assassins were often poisoned, a particularly insidious and favored method due to its relative discretion. A meal, a celebratory drink, a seemingly innocent gesture of thanks, or even a simple flask of water offered after a grueling journey, any could be the vehicle for their agonizing demise. The effects of the poison would frequently be agonizing, leading to a slow, painful, and often undiagnosable death that allowed the employer to feign innocence, express false regret, or even mourn the assassin's sudden demise, further diverting suspicion. This profound betrayal, delivered by the hand that had just offered coin, deepened the assassin's already pervasive sense of isolation, making genuine camaraderie or lasting alliances almost impossible. They existed in a terrifying vacuum of trust, knowing that their very success, the ultimate proof of their dangerous competence, could become the direct catalyst for their own agonizing end. Alternatively, or in conjunction with poisoning, assassins were frequently reported to authorities to avoid paying them. This was a particularly cynical and cost-effective form of double-cross. The employer could alert the local watch, the Lord's men, or even rival factions to the presence of a dangerous murderer in their midst, providing just enough anonymous information, perhaps a description, a known haunt, or a fabricated rumor, to ensure the assassin's capture without implicating themselves. The assassin, now hunted by the very authorities they had sought to evade, would face certain apprehension, brutal torture, and a horrifying public execution. The reward for their deadly service became a grim, agonizing death sentence, while their treacherous employer saved their precious coin, eliminated a dangerous witness, and perhaps even gained public favor for ostensibly helping to bring a criminal to justice. This cynical maneuver powerfully highlights the brutal pragmatism of power in the medieval and early modern world. Human lives, especially those of the desperate, the dispossessed, and the disposable, were cheap commodities, valued only for their immediate utility and then discarded without a second thought. The world they inhabited was one of shifting loyalties and ruthless self-interest. Noble sentiments like gratitude, honor, or fair compensation were luxuries rarely afforded to those who dealt in death. This pervasive betrayal deeply shaped the assassin's day-to-day existence, condemning them to a life of perpetual psychological torment. They lived in constant anxiety, waiting for death to find them, not just from the target's allies, but from their own treacherous patrons. Every shadow held a potential trap, every familiar face a possible hunter, every seemingly innocuous interaction a potential prelude to betrayal. Their sleep, if they found any, was fitful, haunted by nightmares of past deeds and future retribution. Their days were spent in a hypervigilant state, constantly observing, calculating, predicting, unable to truly relax or find peace. This relentless anxiety gnawed at their souls, eroding any semblance of mental well-being. They understood, perhaps more acutely than anyone, the fragility of life and the stark inevitability of their own violent demise. The loneliness of their chosen path was amplified by this constant fear. They could confide in no one, truly trust no one, lest their vulnerabilities be exploited. They were always looking over their shoulder, always planning their next desperate escape, always preparing for the inevitable moment when the hunters, whether official executioners or vengeful rivals or former masters, would finally close in. Their life was a slow, agonizing countdown to the moment their luck ran out, a morbid anticipation of their cold, brutal, and often solitary end. Moreover, their very tools were primitive: kitchen knives, ropes, blunt rocks, bare hands, requiring a brutal, messy proximity to their victims, making the act itself visceral and exposing them further to risk. They were not expert killers by trade, but desperate farmers, failed soldiers, or betrayed lovers driven by circumstance. To survive, they lived as beggars, sick travelers, or street performers, embracing utter anonymity. Their jobs took weeks, not hours, meticulously tracking targets through medieval cities with no maps, no phones, just rumors and dangerous alleys. They faced the chilling risk of dying from disease before even carrying out a job, their bodies vulnerable to common ailments. And the chilling irony was that getting caught was a fate worse than death, as they weren't just executed, but publicly tortured, maimed, or dismembered to set a horrifying example. In conclusion, the glamorous assassin of fiction is a dangerous fantasy. It conveniently omits the chilling reality that their employers were profoundly untrustworthy, routinely ordering their assassins killed to cover their tracks. This ultimate betrayal was a pervasive truth, transforming a supposed business transaction into a death sentence the moment the target fell. Historical assassins lived lives defined not by cool competence, but by desperate precarity, constant paranoia, and an almost inevitable brutal end, often delivered by the very hands that had once offered them blood money. Their story is a powerful, sobering reminder that the real cost of such a profession was a life utterly consumed by violence and betrayal, offering no glory, no peace, and ultimately, no escape from the cold, harsh realities of their unforgiving world. The romanticized assassin of modern fiction often operates in a morally ambiguous world, perhaps with their own skewed code, or simply as an amoral agent of chaos. Religion, if it features at all, is often a backdrop, a distant force rarely capable of truly threatening the protagonist. But this thrilling illusion shatters when confronted with the brutal, pervasive truth of history. For the real historical assassin, operating in an era profoundly shaped by spiritual conviction, religion was not a distant moral compass, but a constant, terrifying threat. The Church, a formidable power that permeated every aspect of medieval and early modern life, saw assassins not merely as criminals or tools of political intrigue, but as embodiments of profound evil, as demons in human form. Consequently, if an assassin were to be caught by religious authorities, their executions were not just brutal. They were horrifyingly creative, designed to inflict maximum agony, public spectacle, and spiritual terror, ensuring both the damnation of the body and the soul. The Church's condemnation of assassination stemmed from its core theological tenets. Taking a human life, especially through premeditated murder, was a grave sin, a direct violation of one of the 10 Commandments. But for an assassin, who deliberately and secretly planned the termination of another's existence, often for personal gain or political machinations, the sin was compounded by deceit, treachery, and a profound disregard for the sanctity of life. Such an act was seen not just as a crime against man, but as a direct affront to God. Furthermore, many religious authorities viewed the assassin as an agent of chaos, disrupting the divinely ordained social order that the Church often upheld. They were perceived as instruments of the devil, their very existence threatening the moral fabric of Christian society. This theological framing elevated the assassin from mere criminal to an almost demonic entity, deserving of the most extreme earthly and eternal damnation. This deep-seated religious abhorrence manifested in the terrifying creativity of their punishments. While secular authorities might execute a murderer, the Church, particularly through the mechanisms of the Inquisition or ecclesiastical courts, aimed not just to end life, but to cleanse the soul through agonizing penance and to deter others through terrifying public spectacle. The methods of execution were often designed to mirror the perceived sin, or to utterly desecrate the body, denying it any chance of resurrection or spiritual peace. One particularly horrifying fate was burning at the stake. This method, primarily reserved for heretics, witches, and the most egregious of moral transgressors, was often applied to assassins, especially if their crime was linked to political conspiracies deemed to challenge divine order, or if they were believed to have acted under demonic influence. The slow, agonizing incineration of the body was meant to purge the soul through fire, mirroring the flames of hell. The public spectacle was designed to be terrifying, a visceral warning to all witnesses of the fate that awaited those who defied both God and earthly authority. The smell of burning flesh, the screams of the condemned, these were not mere side effects but integral components of the horrifying, didactic display. Beyond burning, other forms of religiously sanctioned brutality were common. Drawing and quartering, though often a secular punishment, carried profound religious implications. The public dismemberment of the body, where limbs were torn from the torso by horses, was not just about inflicting pain. It was about denying a whole body for burial, seen as a crucial component for resurrection. This extreme defilement of the physical form aimed to condemn the soul even in the afterlife. Similarly, hanging in chains until the body rotted, or the display of severed heads or limbs on pikes at city gates, served a dual purpose: a secular warning against crime and a grim religious pronouncement of utter damnation, leaving the corpse unburied and exposed to the elements, a fate considered deeply impious. The desecration was spiritual as much as physical. The Church's pervasive influence meant that even if an assassin escaped secular justice, their life would be one of profound spiritual torment. They lived in constant fear of excommunication, a terrifying decree that cast them out of the Christian community, denying them the sacraments, and condemning their soul to hell. For a deeply religious medieval individual, this spiritual death was often more terrifying than any physical execution. They might seek absolution, but the penance for regicide or religiously condemned murder would be immense, often lifelong, and perhaps still not enough to ease their profound guilt. The very act of living with such a sin, coupled with a pervasive belief in divine judgment, would gnaw at their souls, leading to profound anxiety and despair, forcing them to contemplate their ultimate fate. These extreme consequences greatly compounded the already monumental struggles of a historical assassin. They were not expert killers. Most medieval assassins weren't expert killers, but desperate farmers, failed soldiers, or betrayed lovers driven by circumstance, using kitchen knives, ropes, blunt rocks, or their bare hands. To stay hidden, they lived as beggars, sick travelers, or street performers, embracing utter anonymity. Their jobs took weeks to track a target through medieval cities with no maps, no phones, just rumors and dangerous alleys. They faced the chilling risk of dying from disease before even carrying out a job, their bodies vulnerable to common ailments. And the ultimate betrayal awaited them, as they were often killed by their own employers after completing a task to avoid payment and eliminate a dangerous witness. Their own inherent superstitions made their work harder, with belief in curses, witches, and omens like a black cat crossing their path, considered a death sentence. All these layers of peril created a life of constant anxiety, waiting for death to find them, but the chilling truth was that getting caught was a fate worse than death. In conclusion, the glamorous assassin of fiction is a dangerous fantasy. The grim reality of historical assassins reveals individuals caught in a terrifying web, where religion was a constant, formidable threat. The Church, viewing them as demons in human form, ensured that if caught by religious authorities, their executions were not merely brutal, but horrifyingly creative, designed to inflict maximum agony, public spectacle, and spiritual damnation. Their story is a powerful, sobering reminder that the real cost of such a profession was not just a short, violent life, but a terrifying battle for their soul, lived under the chilling shadow of divine wrath and the most exquisite forms of public torment. The romanticized image of an assassin often depicts them as spectral figures, gliding through an urban landscape that bends to their will, a silent master of the metropolis. The city, in fiction, becomes their playground, a canvas for their stealth and cunning, its dark corners their allies. But this thrilling illusion shatters when confronted with the brutal, suffocating truth of history. For the real historical assassin, operating within the labyrinthine heart of medieval urban centers, the city was anything but an ally. It was a constant, terrifying gauntlet, a place where anonymity was precarious and danger lurked in every unlit corner. The chilling reality was that cities were death traps. These medieval metropolises were relentlessly full of tight alleys, vigilant watchmen, and omnipresent, nosy drunks, ensuring that every shadow might be a snitch, turning the very fabric of urban life into a perpetual minefield for anyone daring to operate outside the strictures of law and order. Firstly, the physical layout of medieval cities themselves presented an immense challenge. They were organic, unplanned growths, a dense, chaotic sprawl of narrow, winding streets, densely packed dwellings, and a bewildering maze of tight alleys. These alleys, often no wider than an arm span, were dark, perpetually damp, and choked with refuse. They offered seemingly convenient escape routes or clandestine observation points, but they were also treacherous. A wrong turn could lead to a dead end, trapping an assassin between pursuers and an unyielding wall. The lack of streetlights meant they were plunged into absolute blackness, where footing was uncertain and dangers could materialize from anywhere. These were not the controlled, navigable environments of modern cities. They were claustrophobic labyrinths where disorientation was common, and a simple misstep could prove fatal. Furthermore, these alleys were often the domain of gangs, petty criminals, and the truly desperate, turning every shadowy passage into a potential ambush site for unexpected, violent encounters, entirely unrelated to the assassination itself. The assassin's primary concern wasn't just avoiding the law, but surviving the very ground they walked upon. Compounding this physical labyrinth was the relentless, omnipresent threat of detection from the forces of order. Medieval cities, despite their lack of modern technology, were remarkably well policed by their own standards, thanks to a pervasive system of vigilance. They were relentlessly full of watchmen, often organized into patrols that tirelessly walked the city streets, especially during the long, dark hours of the night. These watchmen, though perhaps armed with only a lantern and a spear, possessed intimate knowledge of their districts, recognizing faces, noting strangers, and quickly growing suspicious of anyone out of place or moving with undue haste. Their duties included maintaining peace, apprehending criminals, and reporting suspicious activity. For an assassin, every encounter with a watchman was a high-stakes gamble. A clumsy answer, a suspicious glance, or an unexpected movement could lead to immediate interrogation, arrest, and the horrifying fate of torture and execution. The watchman were the visible embodiment of the city's intent to control its populace, turning every corner into a potential checkpoint, every unexpected encounter into a life-or-death situation. Beyond official patrols, an assassin's peril was amplified by the unpredictability of the civilian populace, particularly the nosy drunks. Taverns and alehouses were ubiquitous in medieval cities, and intoxication was a common state, especially after nightfall. While drunks might seem harmless, their impaired judgment and loosened tongues made them incredibly dangerous. A drunkard might stumble into an assassin's path, accidentally witnessing a clandestine meeting. Their garrulous nature might lead them to loudly recall a strange sight or a suspicious figure to anyone who would listen, inadvertently becoming a snitch without even realizing it. Their unpredictable movements and loud exclamations could draw unwanted attention, forcing an assassin to abandon a carefully planned approach or escape. The assassin could never truly blend in, for even the most unassuming civilian, particularly one whose inhibitions were lowered by alcohol, could become an unwitting threat, turning a chance encounter into a catastrophic exposure. This created a suffocating atmosphere where every shadow might be a snitch. It was not just official informants or conscious betrayers, but the pervasive sense that the city itself was watching. A silhouette against a distant window, a fleeting glimpse in a reflected puddle, a suspicious movement noticed by a peering eye from a second-story window. Any of these could be enough to trigger an alert. The close-packed nature of medieval buildings meant that neighbors lived in intimate proximity, their lives intertwined, making anonymity a precious and fleeting commodity. The assassin had to assume that any passerby, any street sweeper, any child playing in the gutter, might inadvertently catch a glimpse, hear a sound, or notice a detail that could lead to their undoing. This constant, pervasive paranoia was an immense psychological burden, forcing them to operate in a state of perpetual hypervigilance, unable to truly relax or lower their guard. These urban perils compounded the already monumental challenges faced by a historical assassin. They were not expert killers. Most medieval assassins weren't expert killers, but desperate farmers, failed soldiers, or betrayed lovers driven by circumstance, using kitchen knives, ropes, blunt rocks, or their bare hands. To stay hidden, they lived as beggars, sick travelers, or street performers, embracing utter anonymity. Their jobs took weeks to track a target through medieval cities with no maps, no phones, just rumors and dangerous alleys. They faced the chilling risk of dying from disease before even carrying out a job, their bodies vulnerable to common ailments. And the ultimate betrayal awaited them, as they were often killed by their own employers after completing a task to avoid payment and eliminate a dangerous witness. Their own inherent superstitions made their work harder, with belief in curses, witches, and omens like a black cat crossing their path, considered a death sentence. Their very faith, too, was a constant threat, as the church saw assassins as demons in human form, ensuring that if caught by religious authorities, their executions were horrifyingly creative, designed to inflict maximum agony and spiritual condemnation. All these layers of peril created a life of constant anxiety, waiting for death to find them, knowing that getting caught was a fate worse than death. In conclusion, the romanticized assassin gliding effortlessly through the urban night is a captivating fiction. The grim reality of historical assassins reveals individuals trapped in a suffocating web of peril where cities were death traps. Their supposed domain was relentlessly full of tight alleys that disoriented, vigilant watchmen who patrolled, and unpredictable nosy drunks who could inadvertently expose them. Every single shadow might be a snitch, whether a person or merely the lurking threat of the unseen. Their story is a powerful, sobering reminder that the real cost of such a profession was a life lived in constant, terrifying peril, where the very streets they walked could at any moment betray them to a cold, lonely, and brutal end. The romanticized image of an assassin, so often portrayed in modern entertainment, features a figure who executes a kill with surgical precision, leaving behind no trace, no lingering evidence. The target is dispatched, and almost instantaneously, the body vanishes, spirited away by unseen cleanup crews or dissolved by futuristic chemicals, leaving no discernible trace for the authorities to follow. This seamless, effortless disposal is pure fantasy. The grim, unvarnished truth of historical assassins reveals a terrifying reality that stripped away all glamour. Bodies were excruciatingly hard to hide. In a world utterly devoid of forensics, advanced concealment techniques, or swift, professional disposal services, the assassin was left to grapple with the raw, horrifying physicality of their deed. There were no cleanup crews, no chemicals to dissolve or disinfect. Instead, the assassin faced the arduous, perilous task of moving, concealing, or abandoning a corpse, often forcing them to resort to desperate measures like trying to dump a body in a river or graveyard. If they even made it that far without being detected, the sheer weight and awkwardness of their grim burden constantly threatening to expose them to a fate worse than death. Consider the immediate aftermath of a medieval assassination. The kill, as previously explored, was rarely clean or silent. It was often a brutal, messy affair, leaving behind not just a lifeless form, but a scene of considerable gore, blood pooling on cobblestones, staining clothing, clinging to skin. The assassin, their hands still slick with the visceral evidence of their act, faced an immediate, monumental problem: the body. This was not a convenient prop. It was a heavy, unwieldy mass of flesh and bone, often stiffening with rigor mortis, an undeniable, horrifying testament to their crime. There were no cleanup crews to call, no anonymous services to whisk the corpse away. The assassin was entirely on their own, alone with the terrifying burden of their deed and the palpable presence of their victim. Every precious second counted, for discovery could come at any moment: a patrolling watchman, an early riser, a nosy neighbor, or even a scavenging animal. The pressure was immense, almost unbearable, as they struggled with the physical reality of what they had done. The challenge of disposal was immense. Without advanced forensics, simply moving the body was the greatest risk. Every street was a potential witness, every shadow a possible betrayer. Dragging a corpse, particularly a heavy male body, through narrow, unlit alleys was a monumental physical task, made agonizingly slow by the need for stealth. The body might catch on a corner, scrape against a wall, or leave a telltale trail that could lead pursuers directly back to the crime scene or to the assassin themselves. The effort involved would leave them exhausted, gasping for breath, their muscles screaming in protest, making them vulnerable to capture. And all the while, the chilling presence of the victim, now a cold, lifeless weight, would press down on their conscience, a silent accusation in the terrifying darkness. Their options for disposal were grimly limited, often relying on the cover of night and the desperate hope of obscurity. One primary method was to dump a body in a river. A flowing river could carry the corpse away, perhaps far downstream, making identification difficult or impossible. The water might cleanse the body of immediate evidence, blurring the lines of the crime. However, this was not a simple task. Rivers often had busy banks, even at night, with boatmen, fishermen, or late-night travelers. The sheer effort of dragging a body to the riverbank, perhaps navigating treacherous slopes, and then forcing it into the water without drawing attention, was immense. The splash might be heard, the disturbance noticed. And even if successfully dumped, there was no guarantee the body wouldn't resurface days later, bloated and identifiable, washing up on some unsuspecting shore, bringing the crime back to light. This was a gamble, not a guaranteed solution. Alternatively, an assassin might attempt to dispose of a body in a graveyard. These places, often located on the outskirts of towns, were seen as places of quiet, eternal rest, but for an assassin, they represented a desperate opportunity. Under the cover of darkness, They might attempt to bury the body in a shallow, unmarked grave, hoping it would go unnoticed amongst the countless other plots. But digging a grave, even a shallow one, was an exhausting, noisy endeavor, especially in frozen winter ground, and the risk of encountering other nocturnal visitors, grave robbers, vagrants, or grieving families visiting a loved one, was ever present. The sanctity of the graveyard also carried its own psychological weight, perhaps inducing a chilling discomfort in even the most hardened killer, adding a spiritual dread to the physical effort. The desperate nature of these disposal methods underscores the horrifying reality that assassins were rarely professionals with specialized resources. They were often desperate farmers, failed soldiers, or betrayed lovers driven by circumstance. Their primitive tools, kitchen knives, ropes, blunt rocks, bare hands, meant their kills were messy. To avoid detection, they lived as beggars, sick travelers, or street performers, embracing utter anonymity. Their jobs took weeks to track a target through medieval cities, relying on rumors and dangerous alleys with no maps or phones. They faced the chilling risk of dying from disease before even carrying out a job, their bodies vulnerable. And the ultimate betrayal awaited them, as they were often killed by their own employers after completing a task to avoid payment. Their own superstitions made their work harder, with beliefs in curses, witches, and omens. Religion was a constant threat, with the church seeing them as demons, promising horrifyingly creative executions if caught. All these layers of peril meant they lived in constant anxiety, waiting for death to find them, knowing that getting caught was a fate worse than death. The phrase, "if you made it that far," in the description of body disposal is crucial. It highlights the immense difficulty and myriad dangers involved in simply moving the body from the point of the kill to a disposal site. Many assassins likely never made it. They might be discovered dragging the corpse, their exhaustion and visible efforts betraying them to a patrolling watchman or a curious civilian. They might collapse from exertion, their body found beside their victims. The very act of disposal became a second, agonizing stage of their operation, often more perilous than the kill itself, leading directly to their capture and a gruesome public fate. This physical burden, the chilling reality of grappling with the lifeless form they had created, was a constant, terrifying reminder that their profession offered no glamour, only a cold, visceral confrontation with death and its inescapable aftermath. The romanticized image of the assassin often portrays them as masters of their environment, immune to the mundane frailties that afflict ordinary mortals. They navigate dangers with cunning and skill, their health and well-being rarely a factor in their intricate plans. But this thrilling fiction shatters when confronted with the brutal, indiscriminate reality of historical epidemics. For the real historical assassin, operating in an era defined by devastating outbreaks, particularly the terrifying waves of the Black Death, the omnipresent shadow of disease transformed their already perilous profession into a chilling, unpredictable gamble. The grim truth was that plague made everything worse. During outbreaks, an assassin might find a cynical advantage, able to kill a man and blame the plague for his sudden demise, providing perfect cover for their deadly deed. Yet, this very advantage came with a horrifying, immediate cost, as they also risked dying from it themselves, becoming just another anonymous victim swallowed by the relentless tide of pestilence. Consider the desperate strategic advantage the plague offered. In times of widespread death, when bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, when fear and panic gripped entire populations, the normal meticulous scrutiny of suspicious deaths often broke down completely. A target, perhaps a powerful noble, a troublesome merchant, or a rival claimant to a throne, could be dispatched in a manner that mimicked the symptoms of the plague. A sudden collapse, a quick fever, the appearance of dark swellings, all could be fabricated or subtly induced, and in the prevailing atmosphere of terror, few would question the cause. An assassin could kill a man and blame the plague, a perfect, unassailable cover for their heinous act. The very contagion that devastated cities became a silent accomplice, allowing the assassin to melt away, their hands clean not by skill, but by the overwhelming, indiscriminate nature of the pestilence. Forensic science was non-existent, autopsies were rare, and few dared to closely examine a suspected plague victim. This grim opportunity allowed for a terrifying efficiency: eliminate the target, and let the plague take the blame, ensuring deniability for the employer and a seemingly effortless escape for the killer. The sheer volume of deaths would bury the truth, rendering individual murders indistinguishable from the countless natural or supernaturally attributed fatalities. However, this horrifying advantage came with a terrifying, constant cost. The assassin also risked dying from it themselves. To operate in a plague-ridden city meant breathing the same air, touching the same surfaces, navigating the same overcrowded streets where infection festered unseen. The very act of tracking a target, of moving through dense populations, of entering a victim's dwelling, dramatically increased their exposure. They could acquire the disease from a casual touch in a market, from lingering too long in a contaminated alley, from an innocent conversation with an unwitting carrier. The symptoms, when they struck, were brutal and swift, debilitating fever, agonizing swellings, excruciating pain, and often a rapid descent into delirium and death. Their robust constitution, their martial training, their cunning, none of it offered immunity. The assassin, whose life was already precarious, now faced an enemy that defied all skill, all cunning, all physical prowess. The irony was bitter. A master of death could become death's anonymous pawn, brought down not by a blade or a trap, but by a microscopic foe that leveled all distinctions. The fear of contagion, silent and invisible, became a constant, gnawing companion, even more terrifying than the fear of capture or betrayal. Every cough, every ache, every rising temperature in their own body would send a jolt of paralyzing dread through them, signaling the possible onset of the very disease they used as their perfect alibi. This omnipresent threat exacerbated every aspect of their already brutal existence. They were not expert killers. Most medieval assassins weren't expert killers, but desperate farmers, failed soldiers, or betrayed lovers driven by circumstance. Their primitive tools, kitchen knives, ropes, blunt rocks, bare hands, meant their kills were messy, increasing contact and thus exposure risk. To stay hidden, they lived as beggars, sick travelers, or street performers, mingling with the very populations most susceptible to outbreaks, their disguises doubling as vectors for infection. Their jobs took weeks, not hours, meticulously tracking targets through medieval cities with no maps, no phones, just rumors and dangerous alleys, prolonging their exposure to disease-ridden environments. They faced the chilling risk of dying from disease before even carrying out a job from any common illness, a threat magnified exponentially by plague. And the ultimate betrayal awaited them, as they were often killed by their own employers after completing a task to avoid payment and eliminate a dangerous witness. A betrayal that often came through poison, ironically mimicking plague symptoms. Their own inherent superstitions made their work harder, with beliefs in curses, witches, and omens like a black cat crossing their path, adding psychological strain. Religion was a constant threat, with the church seeing them as demons, promising horrifyingly creative executions if caught by religious authorities. The very environments they operated in, cities, were death traps, full of tight alleys, watchmen, and nosy drunks, where every shadow might be a snitch, and every breath could be tainted. And the gruesome challenge of hiding bodies, with no cleanup crews or chemicals, forcing them to dump corpses in rivers or graveyards, further exposed them to the pervasive filth and infection that characterized plague-ridden areas. All these layers of peril meant they lived in constant anxiety, waiting for death to find them, knowing that getting caught was a fate worse than death. In conclusion, the glamorous assassin of fiction is a profound deception. The grim reality of historical assassins reveals individuals trapped in a terrifying ecosystem of violence and vulnerability, where plague made everything worse. While it offered a chillingly effective cover, allowing an assassin to kill a man and blame the plague, it simultaneously and ruthlessly exposed them to the very same, often agonizing, fate, as they also risked dying from it themselves. Their story is a powerful, sobering reminder that the real cost of such a profession was not just a short, violent life, but a terrifying gamble against an invisible, indiscriminate enemy that could strike them down at any moment, reducing their carefully planned violence to an utterly meaningless footnote in the overwhelming tragedy of a global pandemic. The romanticized image of the assassin often portrays them as masters of the night, cloaked in its impenetrable shadows, moving with silent grace through the sleeping city, their element a canvas for their deadly artistry. The darkness, in fiction, is their ally, their accomplice, their shield against detection. But this thrilling illusion shatters when confronted with the brutal, suffocating truth of history. For the real historical assassin, operating in any medieval or early modern urban center, the night wasn't your friend. It was a vast, unpredictable, and profoundly hostile domain. Its cloaking shadows merely concealed a multitude of dangers, for the streets swarmed with criminals, wild dogs, and vigilant guards, ensuring that one wrong turn, one misstep, one moment of ill luck, and you'd vanish into history as just another nameless corpse, your grim mission incomplete, your life extinguished by forces entirely unrelated to your target. Consider the pervasive, unlit chaos that descended upon a medieval city after dusk. There were no streetlights as we know them, save for the occasional flickering lantern carried by a watchman or a wealthy traveler. The vast majority of the urban landscape was plunged into an absolute, disorienting blackness, where footing was treacherous and visibility almost nil. This made navigation profoundly difficult, forcing an assassin to rely on memory, touch, and the distant, indistinct sounds that pierced the oppressive quiet. This profound darkness was not an empty void. It was a teeming, dangerous ecosystem, utterly indifferent to human intent, where survival became a constant, nerve-wracking gamble. Foremost among the threats were the myriad criminals who emerged under the cover of night. The tight alleys and shadowed doorways of medieval cities were the hunting grounds for gangs of desperate thieves, ruthless cutthroats, and opportunistic brigands. These were not sophisticated masterminds, but often starving, desperate individuals, driven to violence by poverty and hunger. An assassin, regardless of their own deadly purpose, was simply another lone figure, a potential mark in the darkness. A wrong turn into a particularly notorious alley, a rustle that drew attention, or even the glint of a hidden coin, could instantly turn the hunter into the hunted. A street mugging could end not just in the loss of precious resources, but in a fatal brawl, leaving the assassin bleeding out in the grime, their identity and mission utterly irrelevant to their demise. The professional killer could be undone by the casual violence of the city's underbelly, their calculated mission ending in an ignoble, anonymous death at the hands of common thugs who cared nothing for their target or their employer's machinations. Adding to this human menace were the packs of wild dogs. Medieval cities were notoriously unsanitary, their streets often choked with refuse, offal, and the waste of both humans and animals. This created a fertile scavenging ground for numerous packs of feral canines, often aggressive, perpetually hungry, and instinctively territorial. These weren't domesticated pets. They were untamed beasts, capable of attacking anyone they perceived as a threat or a source of food. A sudden growl from a dark doorway, a flash of teeth in the gloom, could lead to a terrifying, desperate struggle for life. The assassin, burdened by their tools, their disguise, and their need for silence, would find themselves in a brutal, visceral fight against an unexpected, non-human foe. A severe bite could lead to infection, crippling injury, or even death from rabies, derailing their mission in the most ignominious way possible, far from the grand confrontation with their intended target. And then, there were the guards. Despite the darkness and the chaotic layout, medieval cities did employ various forms of nightly watch, patrols, night watchmen, and citizen militias. These guards, though perhaps armed with only a lantern and a spear, possessed intimate knowledge of their districts, recognizing faces, noting strangers, and quickly growing suspicious of anyone out of place or moving with undue haste. Their job was to maintain peace, apprehend criminals, and report suspicious activity. For an assassin, every flicker of a distant lantern, every sound of approaching footsteps, every casual encounter with a watchman was a high-stakes gamble. A clumsy answer, a suspicious glance, or an unexpected movement could lead to immediate interrogation, arrest, and the horrifying fate of torture and execution. The guards were the vigilant eyes and ears of authority, turning every corner into a potential checkpoint, every unexpected encounter into a life-or-death situation, making the very act of traversing the city a perilous game of cat and mouse. The chilling reality was that one wrong turn and you'd vanish into history as just another nameless corpse. The vast, anonymous nature of a bustling medieval city meant that bodies, especially those of the poor or those found in desolate alleys, often went unclaimed, unidentified, and unmourned. If an assassin succumbed to a criminal's knife, a wild dog's bite, or a guard's sudden blow, their meticulously planned mission, their employer's grand design, and their own desperate struggle for survival would all end in utter obscurity. Their death would be attributed to simple misfortune, a common occurrence in a brutal age, their true identity and purpose lost to the annals of history, their story never told. There would be no fanfare, no investigation, no recognition of their dark profession, just a quiet, ignominious end, their body perhaps eventually disposed of in a common grave, indistinguishable from the daily toll of disease and poverty. This nightmarish landscape deeply compounded the already monumental challenges faced by a historical assassin. They were not expert killers. Most medieval assassins weren't expert killers, but desperate farmers, failed soldiers, or betrayed lovers driven by circumstance. Their primitive tools, kitchen knives, ropes, blunt rocks, bare hands, meant their kills were messy, increasing their exposure. To stay hidden, they lived as beggars, sick travelers, or street performers, mingling with the very threats they sought to avoid. Their jobs took weeks to track a target through medieval cities with no maps, no phones, just rumors and dangerous alleys. They faced the chilling risk of dying from disease before even carrying out a job. And the ultimate betrayal awaited them, as they were often killed by their own employers after completing a task. Their own superstitions made their work harder, with beliefs in curses and omens. Religion was a constant threat, viewing them as demons. Cities were death traps by day, and even more so by night. Hiding bodies was almost impossible, with no cleanup crews or chemicals. The plague, too, made everything worse, offering a perfect alibi but a terrifying risk of infection. All these layers of peril meant they lived in constant anxiety, waiting for death to find them, knowing that getting caught was a fate worse than death. In conclusion, the romanticized assassin gliding effortlessly through the urban night is a captivating fiction. The grim reality of historical assassins reveals individuals trapped in a terrifying ecosystem where the night wasn't your friend. Instead, its unlit streets swarmed with criminals, wild dogs, and vigilant guards, creating a gauntlet of unpredictable dangers. Every shadow might be a snitch, every unexpected encounter a potential end. Their story is a powerful, sobering reminder that the real cost of such a profession was a life lived in constant, terrifying peril, where the very darkness they sought to master could, at any moment, betray them to an anonymous, brutal end, reducing them to nothing more than a nameless corpse in history's vast, unforgiving annals.